Hello everybody, it's nice to be back, and we're going to start with a special treat, because since 2011 there was a big surprise. Can anyone tell me what big surprise happened in 2011? Coincidentally, it also happened in England, Gibraltar. What happened in 2011? Hint, Korchnoi was involved. That was the time he played Caruana at the age of, can somebody help me with the age? Yes, around 80, actually 79. Korchnoi won. So that was a big, huge upset, basically 6 years ago. And now, the biggest upset of this year happened at Isle of Man, chess.com Open. And what was that? Who was the big hero of the tournament? James Tarjan. And what's amazing about this, that Tarjan just came back from retirement. So in honor of this great achievement, obviously we're going to go through this now legendary game that he played against Kramnik. But first I want to show Tarjan's famous and really good endgames that I found, and I want to share with all of you. So Tarjan is famous for being what?
A librarian.
A librarian, yes. But mostly for being an Olympic medalist. He's part of the team of the first gold medal team. And in fact, his opponent, Larry Evans, the second of Bobby Fischer, was his teammate. So in this game, not surprisingly, it's going to be a Sicilian, because Sicilian was a big thing in the 70s and 80s because of Tal. Also later on there'll be Karpov-Korchnoi matches where the dragon will be featured. Knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, e6, g4. Can somebody tell me what opening is this? The Keres attack. So it was a big thing then. So h6, it was really popular. Kasparov's second was kind of experimenting with this, especially with h4 and h5. And long theory happened. But here, there's an age-old idea for white that Tarjan played. That's not really played these days. Everyone plays h3. Can anyone? h4 was the modern one. G5, exactly. G5 is so old that I was scanning through informators, and that's how I knew about the move G5. And I actually played it in a junior tournament, and I drew 2500 when I was like 2350. So G5 is actually a very exciting move. I'm actually showing this game. It will eventually transpose into an endgame, so you can see how Tarjan has an exact plan how to aim for positional pressure, which will eventually lead to a wonderful endgame for him. So h takes, bishop takes g5, knight c6. How should we continue? Knight takes c6, b takes c6, e5 is an interesting idea, but we can come back to action later. And that's what he did. He played queen d2, a6, and now castle. Yeah. Queen c7, h4. Now h4 is a very deep idea. It's kind of preparing the pressure on the e6 pawn, which will be very important for the whole game. Bishop d7, how should we continue here? If we're trying to pressure on the e6 square. Yeah, bishop h3. And the main idea will be very apparent soon. Bishop e7. How should we continue now? F4, yeah, like a caveman. F4, and after takes, castle, king b1, king b8, f5. And this looks very, very cavemanish, but it's a very deep idea that Tarjan has. The point is, he wants to soften the e6 pawn so it will move. Now, evens obliges and lets the d5 square weakened. And that will be it, basically. Queen f2. Now there's the basic threat. What is white threatening right now? Yeah, bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6. So I will show you if black would play something terrible as bishop c8, white would take on f6, bishop takes f6, and knight d5. And that knight on d5 is a monster. And even if white would lose the h4 pawn, it doesn't really matter because that knight just dominates the game. So Evans has to do his best to stop that. So he plays bishop c6. Now, this is what Tarjan was really good, and you'll see in the eventual games. He knows when to rush things and when not to rush action. How should he continue right now? Rook g1 would be a bit suspicious on accounts of knight takes e4. The pawn is a bit loose at the moment, so we need to defend that. So he plays bishop g2, defends it, rook c8, bishop f3, trying to hint at the idea of h5, h6, which would destabilize the knight on f6. b5, which is kind of threatening b4, and another very nice prophylactic move happens here. a3. No more b4 ideas. Actually, the famous Moldovan Grandmaster once said, if b5 happens and bishop b7, a3 is always a nice move to make, because it will stop b4 ideas forever. And it will actually stop b4 ideas forever, surprisingly. Bishop b7, rook d2, rook d8, rook d1, rook d7. And now bishop takes f6 with the idea of exchanging the knights. Queen a7. And now there's a big dilemma for white. Should he exchange queens or not? Who says we should exchange queens? Raise your hand if you think we should exchange queens. Well, let's see, if takes, king takes, you do win the pawn, but that pawn is basically worthless on d6 at the moment. So, well, we have an opposite colored bishop ending coming up. So it all depends on the future where you can potentially put your pieces. Where can white potentially put his pieces that could actually be decisive in the long run? If we would have some magic powers, where could we pose this bishop? Where would we put it? On d5. Yes, it would be a god there. But how could we achieve it in the long term? Yeah, exactly. Rook d2, bishop d1, c3, bishop b3. So it could be achieved. So should we exchange queens now? Or should we wait or just keep the queens on? What's black planning to do in the long term? Does he have any big plans?
C5.
Yeah, he has some plans on doubling on the C line. Can white kind of counter that? Yeah, so it's not a big deal. So Tarjan decided to take on a7, king takes.
Take with the king, right?
Yeah. And now defended the pawn. Because especially in endgames, just defend your pieces. It's the most important thing. Because you don't have many pieces left. And how else are you going to mate your opponent if you don't have pieces left? Rook c6, c3, king b7, rook g1. Now, rook g1, this move I really like. Because basically it stops black from ever bringing out the bishop. And also planning to maneuver the bishop through d1 to b3.
Wow.
King c7, rook d2. But notice that Tarjan realized, I have time. I don't need to hurry. You can't do anything. You're just waiting for me to just slowly destroy your position. So just enjoy, have a tea, and watch how I just crush you. Rook d8. And now comes the brilliant move, bishop d1. King d7, bishop b3. And now we achieve the dream position. And can we say that white is winning? Well, not yet. But slowly, slowly, black is losing oxygen because he's running out of ideas. King e7, bishop d1. Now this might look like a mysterious move, and I admit it is a mysterious move. But it actually emphasizes the fact that black can't really do anything. It all depends on what white wants to do. And this is more uncomfortable than it looks, because in a chess game, your time is ticking. You're trying to find some coherent plan for black, but you can't. There is no in this position.
He's almost in Sicilian.
Yeah, he is basically in Sicilian. So white can get away with kind of maneuvering and just probing black a little bit. Rook c4, bishop f3, just kind of stating that I will chase you away eventually. a5, king a2. Where is that king headed? Most probably to b3. Rook b8, king b3. And now black doesn't venture and doesn't go this far, but he could actually try a4. And even though it looks like a counterintuitive move, because you're supposed to put your pawns mostly on black squares so the white bishop can't reach it, but in this case it would stop white from developing an initiative on the queen side. And the only way white could be able to open up the position is to eventually blow up the position with c4, but then the a3, b2 pawn also gets weak. Rook c6. But Larry even sticks to the waiting principle, which is also a very good way of defending. Because if your position is sound enough, the way you can defend like slightly worse positions is not to move many of your pieces. If you believe that your position is safe, you can so-called sit and just wait and say, okay, you're a wonderful player. You might be a champion or something, but I'll wait you out and you'll have no chance of beating me. But okay, Tarjan says, I'll beat you somehow slowly. Bishop e2, rook b6, rook d5. Big improvements are in progress. The rook actually occupied this important square, and now we can sense the weakness, which is that glaring weakness in black's position. That juicy b5 pawn. Now the problem is, black would love to play b4. But then we create the passed pawn, and that pawn will decide the game. Because this extra bishop, basically, who has no opposition whatsoever, will just act as an extra piece, and that's how white will win the game.
And that the dark squared bishop for black is, like you said, with the rook,
Yeah.
is out of the game.
Yeah, exactly. Like you say, the bishop on f6 is totally out of the game. It's kind of biting granite at the moment, biting on the e5 pawn, which is not useful in chess, at least. King d7, rook d1. And you can see how slowly Tarjan coordinates his pieces. He does not hurry. King c7, rook g1. And this is a waiting move. Seemingly, this is innocuous, but it's kind of playing with your opponent, asking, so what are you going to do next? He has all of his pieces lined up for defense, but now he will have to move one of those pieces out of the best practical positions. And that's why sometimes, like great grandmasters wait around and move around, like Nakamura and Caruana, because they want to force their opponents to discomfort their pieces. King d7, and that king doesn't really belong on d7. It would rather be on c7. Rook d1, king c7, king c2, bishop g5, rook g1, bishop f6. And now Tarjan decided it's time to make a splendid move. And he just puts another squeeze in the position. How can he tighten the squeeze on black here? b4, exactly. Now, it's very interesting in chess that sometimes you have to make moves that contradict themselves. Why am I putting all my pawns on black squares? Well, I have no other choice. This is the only way I can fix this weakness on b5. And for that, I'm even willing to put a pawn on black square, because in order to win a game, you need at least two weaknesses from your opponent. Now, b5 is one, a5 is one, and actually, to win this game, white will be able and will need to open up a line. Otherwise, if there's no entry to the black's position, it would be a draw, obviously. A takes b4. And now this is also an important decision. And then actually a dilemma. Which pawn to take with? You take with the a pawn.
Because he cannot take the 5, right? Because he will lose the b5.
It's true. If you take with the a pawn, he can't capture the a line. On the other hand, even in opposite colored bishop rook endgames, you're always aiming for a passer. Yeah, in that case, we'll take with the c pawn, yes. I mean, a is also fine, because eventually we might keep the b pawn and just roll with it, with the c4 break. Also, let's say a takes b4, king moves, and slowly we'll build up enough pressure and defense on the b4 pawn that we'll be able to play c4. Let's say something like rook b1 and c4 and maybe b5 ideas. Let's say king c7, c4, takes b5. It's a bit of a counterintuitive defense, but I have enough defenders on b5 and I'll take on c4 later. Now, the other thing that white really needs to be careful is not to allow black to build a blockade. Because if the bishop somehow could get to b6, draw wouldn't be too far away. So Tarjan decides to take with the c pawn. And this actually achieves two things. One, potentially we might have a passed pawn, and two, we'll have the c line for action. Rook b7, how can we get the c line? Yeah, he played king b2, but king b3 is also okay. King b8, rook g3. Another little bit of a twist in this king g3 move. White is in no hurry of letting the bishop out to g5, because if you just let the ghost out just once, it'll get activated and it might cause problems later on. Rook g3, king c7, bishop d1, king d7, rook c3. And now, when the black king crossed to the queen side, then James Tarjan decides to cut off the king. And now this is a very good moment, because he'll either have to exchange a rook, but then the b5 pawn will be weak forever, or wait and just see his own demise, which will happen pretty slowly. Rook c7, takes, bishop b3, bishop g5, rook d3. Now, black managed to put the bishop on g5, but it's already too late. rook d3, a very good move. It defends against bishop maneuvers to d4, which would be annoying, while also planning to shift the rook to the c-line. Bishop d5, bishop h6, rook c3, king b8, and now comes a very good liquidating move by Tarjan. Yeah, rook c6.
He has to take, and then you're going to win the other
Yeah.
pawn. I mean, the b pawn.
Yes, and otherwise he can't even defend himself, because if the king moves, then just check, and then slowly the king will move up a4 and it's totally busted. So he has to take, but that's basically the end of the game, because as we know in opposite colored endgames, the two passers decide the game. So king b6, bishop c4, king c6, king b3, bishop d2, check, a4, a5, and king a4.
Oh, boy.
And a brilliant game by Tarjan.
That was great.
What was really amazing and what I really like is his use of the king. I'm going to show more games where he uses his king to full effect. And even in this game, he first brings his king, then he pushes the pawn, because he knows that these pawns in endgames need the support to actually be powerful enough to win it. Otherwise, if the pawns would have been pushed too far, let's say if I play a really donkey move like b5, king c5, a4, bishop a5, and oops, we can agree to a draw and enjoy our days. But Tarjan was more clever and planned to bring the king first, then push the pawn on the black squares, and this way the king can help the pawns move further forward, and then that way he won. Tarjan is known for his 1976 gold medal. A very, very strong team. So here he plays the legendary Bent Larsen, and he's obviously a pawn down, so he's not going to win this game, but he's going to save it against such a legend as Bent Larsen. Bent played rook a3, the great Scandinavian player, and now Tarjan plays knight c2, rook h3, rook e2. Now notice that he brings all of his pieces to defense. And that's how you're supposed to play an endgame. Use as many of your forces as possible to pull your position together. Notice that he's a pawn down, so he needs the extra forces to defend the position. Knight h4. How can we potentially stop the idea of knight f3? Knight d4. Pretty nice active move, bringing the knight to the center and also trying to hint at active play if necessary. Knight f3, maybe not the best move, because as there's this common saying, all rook endgames are drawn, knight f3 wasn't the best idea. Most probably a king move coming closer would have been better. Knight f3 takes. And now Bent Larsen is kind of preparing to bring the king closer. How can Tarjan stop that?
G2.
Rook g2, yes. So there's two ways of playing these endgames. First, you want to achieve your own goal, and the second, and not least, you want to stop all of your opponent's plans. So okay, he wanted to play king g6, so he plays rook f4 and king e3 and then g5. Now, Tarjan felt that his position is a little bit passive, so he activates his rook. Rook g3, king g6, rook h3. The plan he had in mind, I think, is to bring the rook behind the black king and start annoying Bent Larsen with checks. Now he played rook h4. And now comes the dilemma, which is always difficult, whether to enter the endgame or not. Obviously, we don't have a choice here. If we take our rook away, we'll lose the pawn. So we'll have to take. G takes h4. And we'll still have to calculate here, because if we calculate badly, we lose. Now James Tarjan calculated perfectly and found a pretty spectacular draw in this position.
King F4 followed by H3.
King F4, the first move is correct. H3, I'm not sure.
Okay.
King F4, F5.
You got to keep the pawn on h2.
Mhm.
Then
Yeah, it could. It might be the idea of keeping the pawn on h2 till the opportune moment. So he played King E3, King F7, and there's a thing called distant opposition. King F3. And obviously, these are top level GMs of the 70s and 80s, so they know that
What's the number on the opposition to keep it?
There should always be at least even number of squares.
yeah, there should be some even number of squares, yeah.
So right
These,
now, or there should be an odd number between
Yeah.
the pieces, excuse me.
yes. So King E6 has been played here. We block again, King F4, King F6, and now he comes up with a really good counterintuitive idea.
He drops the king back. No, then the king flies.
Yeah, he will make a king move, but the question is where?
king e3.
King E3. Why is King E3 so illogical? Because it is. It is so illogical.
He loses the position.
Yeah, it loses opposition. So why did he do that? What did he miss? Or did he miss something?
I've seen the one, it's like a book, and then it's like if you play king f3, it loses.
Mhm. So King E5 was played. King F3, F4. How did he continue?
He can't go to G4. That's just a loss.
He can't go to G4 because then the king goes to E4 and the
Yeah, it
pawn
marches
just
in.
marches in. And well, he continued with his plan. King E2,
Yeah, that's what I was looking at.
King E4, King F2, F3, King E1, King E3, King F1, F2, and what now?
Push the pawn.
H3. And sadly for Bent Larsen,
He's
there's no more moves for him
it's still
apart from King F3, which is a draw. So the whole point of White's play was realizing that he has this extra H3 pawn move,
he couldn't make it when I wanted to make
which
it.
he can use as a stalemate trick, and then actually is a drawn position. So this was an extremely nice save against a top player like Bent Larsen in the 80s, 79, 80s. And this one is also a very nice one. This will be a heavy piece endgame. He plays King G7 after King H2. And what's great about King G7 is that he's asking, okay, everything I have is in good position. I just improve my pieces slowly, getting my king a bit closer for the endgame. Rook C5, takes. And White manages to exchange off this important piece on B5. But where can Black find the weaknesses in White's position? Yeah, near B1, B2, A2 is the weakest of all the pawns in this position. But we have a rook here on E8 that does nothing. So Tarjan comes up with a pretty amazing idea here. Yes. Queen B1, that's what he played first, A3 and Rook A8. His plan, as simple as it may look, is Rook A6, Rook B6, as just you said. And after that, white will be kind of hog-tied and will not be able to move at all. King g2, rook a6, rook b6, queen d2. And now he plays rook b5. A really good move because he's slowly trying to improve his pieces and wait for the opportune moment to strike. He's not in any rush to get white out of this trouble. Rook b5, queen e2, king g8. He's waiting. Also, he doesn't want to get into checks. That's why he moves his king to g8. Queen d2, king h7, king g7. He's kind of tangoing around, playing with his opponent a bit. Queen d2, queen a2, queen e2, queen b3. Queen d2, rook b6. So the rook has done its job now. So it goes back. King g8, king g1, rook a6, rook c3, queen b6. Now, the constant waiting is taking a toll on white, and he's breaking. So he decides to act. He should have waited, but it's kind of frustrating just to defend your position constantly. e4, d takes, queen takes, rook b6. Now, this was a real grandmaster trick. Black was kind of giving the impression that, oh, I gave up on the idea of invading on the queen side. He moved all his pieces back, and when his opponent said, oh, okay, you gave up on the idea of assaulting me on the queen side, he says, haha, not that way, and he's coming back with the rook to b6. Rook e5, queen f6. And now, even though this check looks pretty aggressive, it's nothing, it's just a check. The king will move to g7, and the queen defends Black's position quite well. Queen e2, rook b3. And now the position improved dramatically for Black, because before the position was closed and it was difficult to get close to white's pawns. But after this e4 opening, the d4 pawn is visibly weak. King g2, queen d6, rook e4, king g7. Not in a rush, bringing the king closer, because what happens if it eventually would turn into an endgame? f3, queen d5, king h2, and now Tarjan decided it was time. What did he play here? Queen b5. It was the right moment to play queen b5, exactly, because the king was perfectly placed on g7. Everything was ready for the exchange. And also, mind you, the black king is better now on g7 than the king on h2. And white just moved the king away from the queen side, which will be decisive. Takes, takes, rook e2, rook b3. And actually, a double attack will occur, because if white would play king g2 instead of rook c2, then black can already play rook d3, and the d4 pawn will hang and will be dropped. Because if rook e7, then we have check first, then we can take on b2. So Tarjan slowly squeezed the life out of white's position, and now he's winning a pawn. Rook takes f3, rook c4, check, takes, king f6. And look, if the king would be on g8, it would be an extra tempo to go to f6. But because of the exact timing of Tarjan, the king can come and crawl up to the center to d5, threatening pawn wins on d4. Rook a8, king e6, rook e8, king d6, king f8, king e7. But also, he's not in any hurry. He's a pawn up. So he doesn't need to rush with the attack. Rook b8, king e6, a4, king d5. Now, this is the way you play endgames. You bring your king when the endgame comes. And actually, the difference is striking. This king on h3 is miserable
You can't get out.
on the side. You can't even get out, as you pointed out, because if g4, then just rook b3 check, and then white loses. So basically, black has a king advantage. a5, rook b5. White is trying a little trickery with a6 ideas, because if we would take, a6 happens and the b2 rook would be hanging, but Tarjan says, no, 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 no tricks. Rook d8, king e4, rook d7, rook takes a5, king takes d4, c5. Now, after you have an amazing king in the center supporting your pawn, sometimes the quality of your pawn is more important than the measly pawns that you have left. Obviously, you defend it if you can, but in this case, this pawn is just so fast, it doesn't really matter if he takes on g6 or not. He takes, but it really doesn't matter. Rook d5. And this is the other reason active kings are useful. The king can support the rook, so when he would try to get under our pawn, we just stop it with rook c5, and now the only thing left to do is hide with our king, preferably not in front of our pawns. So how do we win after rook d6 check?
You move your king to c4.
If you move your king to c4, you block your pawn a little bit. It's still a good move, but it's not what we desire. Our main threat is to just rush with the pawn and just queen.
King e3 then.
Yeah, king e3, rook e6, king f2, king g1. And while trapping the white king on h3, c2, c1, queen is unstoppable.
The rook can't get there.
That's a superb king.
The king is a fighting piece.
The king is a fighting piece, exactly. So the other important game I wanted to show was against his fellow player, fellow winner at the Olympiads, of the 76 Olympiads, Kavalek. Well, we could say it's around equal, slightly better for black, for the reason that the pawns are pretty weak on b4 and e4. So he plays bishop b7, queen c5, and now he does something that is very noteworthy. He fixes white's structure. How did he do that? Notice that all of the pawns in front of the white king is on black squares. Apart from the e4 pawn, which is pretty weak, which is a good news. So he played h5, which is a beautiful psychological trick. The reason is Kavalek played queen c5 with the intention of taking on b6, trying to liquidate. And Tarjan gave a choice, saying, okay, you can liquidate, but then I'll fix your structure. You can choose, maybe you can take on h5, but then I'll get a passed pawn, or you don't take my pawn and I get to fix your structure. And it worked like a charm, because Kavalek wanted to exchange the queens even at the cost of h5. Now the great idea of h5 is that in the long run, these pawns on the king side will be pretty weak. f3, and now another great idea pops up in Tarjan's head and plays another fixing move.
e5.
e5 is an option. He found a different one.
b5.
Which one?
b5.
b5. b5 fixes the b4 pawn, but also puts the pawn in danger because of bishop f1s and hitting on. Like b5 would run into bishop f1 ideas, pressuring on b5. How can we put pressure on the e4 pawn? f5. And the point is that after takes, this bishop is very much alive, while that bishop is dead and has to cover the f3 pawn. Before that, f3 was trying to help this bishop get a defender so it can move away to f1. So f5 takes, f4, he's actively trying to exchange, but Tarjan doesn't mind, takes, king f7. As we've seen before, the king is key in the endgames, and the difference of the kings will decide. King f2, king e6, king e3, king d5. The rook was already well positioned on d4, kind of tying down the rook on b1. King d5 also brings the king closer, while also shutting out the white king from entering the queen side. Rook c1, he decides to sacrifice the pawn. I wouldn't say losing the pawn, because he wants to get active and try to put some pressure on the black pawns. Rook c1, he takes the pawn, obviously, check, g6. In general, don't leave your pawns en prise if you don't have a good reason. White had a good reason. He wanted to get active. Rook d7, king c6, rook g7, rook e4, check. He has this check and gives this check for one reason, to defend the pawn.
Exactly.
And also, rook e4 has another idea. Please tell me which side you're going. Either you're going to the queen side, trying to stop the b pawn, or you go back to the f line, trying to defend the king side pawns. You have to choose. When the king was on e3, white could decide, depending on the situation, where he wants to go. So he chose to go d3, rook e6, king d4, b5. And now we can see that both the rook and king works and coordinates pretty well in this position. Rook b8, rook d6, check. Another question, where are you heading to? Which way are you going? So he decides to go to c3. If he would go to e5, there's a very good idea here. I'm sure Tarjan was preparing to play that. What could black do here? Yes, king c5. And the good thing with this king c5 move is, obviously it doesn't lose, because we can just push the rook to c6. We'll cut your king off, and we'll just push the pawn till it queens. Hopefully it does, and it will. So he can't go to e5 just because of this king c5, and he would be cut off. So he can't get too active, which is important. If he would get active, he would get some drawing chances. King c3, king d5. Our king is kind of saying, okay, we're going for your pawns. Yeah. King d3, king c5, check. Now notice he could have played king c5, but that doesn't really pose much questions. It's pretty obvious what your intentions after king c5. After king d5, king d3, king c5, white again will have to decide, am I going to defend my pawns, or am I going to stop the b pawn? So he decides to stop the b pawn, king c4. This is a better move than king d4, I think, because it's closer to the b pawn and also prepares b4, b3 ideas. Rook c8, king d4, and what a surprise, the same idea. Rook e8, king d2 was also an option. Rook e8, rook c6 check, king d2, b4. Rook b8, king c4, king c2, rook a6. And slowly, Tarjan is pushing Kavalek down. Rook c8, king d4, rook b8. But now, black decides it's time to give away the b pawn because there's too many defenders there. But look, there's no one defending the king side. So he goes for those pawns. rook g2 takes, king e3, check, king f2, and suddenly black shifts all his pieces to the king side and takes all the pawns. Takes, rook g4, takes, check, chasing the king away, takes on h4, and this is trivial because 2 pawns should be winning. And in this case, even though he gave up the h5 pawn, the f pawn is just strolling in. King e2 doesn't work because of rook e4 check. So this was another good example of him using the king. And as a finishing touch, I want to show the game that was the sensation of Isle of Man, the game between Kramnik and Tarjan. Now, in this position, Tarjan played knight d4. Who would you say is better in this position? Yeah, black is better. He's better because of the domination of his pieces. Now, Kramnik took on d4, e takes d4, and now he plays a move you'd never guess, which is not bad, but surprising and, as it turns out, not good.
Oh, I saw it.
Yeah. So another moves would be like queen takes b3, and the position would be around slightly better for Kramnik, but is not that bad for white. So black played bishop f3. But Tarjan calculated further, and he found the refutation. And bishop takes f3. And if queen takes f1? Yes, bishop e2. And suddenly, Kramnik's queen is trapped. Now I have to add that this game was extra dramatic because Kramnik, who's number 2 in the world, so don't forget that Tarjan was playing Kramnik number 2 in the world, who was trying to qualify for the candidates and still has some theoretical chances before this game, but not much after this one, because this win from Tarjan basically takes all the chances away from Kramnik for qualifying for the candidates, at least through rating points. So he goes for knight takes g3, f takes g3, queen f1. Now, Tarjan plays a very nice consolidating move. And in positions when you're better or near winning, it's important to learn how to consolidate. And that Tarjan does very, very well. Bishop f2. And this bishop f2 is very smooth because it defends the f3 bishop, the e1 bishop simultaneously. Also giving the option for Kramnik to exchange queens, which he really doesn't want. So he plays queen d3, rook c3, queen f5. And I really like this move, what Tarjan plays here. A very good technical move. What did Tarjan play? King g2. Very good move. In winning positions, it's very important to connect your pieces because it's easy to make a mess of winning positions. Let's say, I see a winning fork here, bishop g4, but I blundered the bishop. That's how easy it is to mess up winning positions. So king g2 is a very good move, saying, okay, I see this bishop g4 idea, but first I defend the f2 bishop. Rook f6, and notice that Kramnik is still trying to put some pressure, and that's what you need to do when you're kind of in trouble. Try to place for some tricks. Just try to put some pressure on your opponent. Queen c2, offering an exchange, because it would be a good deal. No thank you. g4, another good move. white is basically stopping any active counterplay of pieces with g4. No more queen f5 ideas, no more ideas of sacrificing or anything on the king side. Rook c6, inviting for an exchange. Should we oblige? Should we exchange? Or should we make a different move? He plays rook c5. Now the idea is that he doesn't want to build the center for Kramnik, because if you take, b takes, the d5 pawn is not weak anymore. And if we're getting really objective in this position, black is only a pawn and a rook for two bishops. So white is clearly winning. But if he gets an extra pawn or he gets to exchange many pieces, he can eventually hope for a fortress or a draw. I mean, getting a fortress and then eventually draw. So Tarjan doesn't want a fortress. He wants a passer. So he puts pressure on the d5 pawn, and eventually he'll get Kramnik to do some exchanges, because this pawn is basically hard to defend without a pawn protection. Rook d8. And how can we put some more pressure on the d5 pawn? Remember, if you have some extra material, exchanging pieces is a good idea. Queen f5, exactly. That's what James Tarjan played. Now, if black starts to exchange everything, that wouldn't be a great achievement for him, but he has no choice because the d5 is too weak, and if he loses that pawn, white will get a passed pawn supported by the bishops, which is just losing. So rook c5, queen takes d7, d takes c5, d4, and now as we saw in previous games, Tarjan knows what is the strongest piece in the endgame, and you should know too.
King.
The king. So what should white play here?
Oh, does he bring it to e1 and comes back around to front?
Yes, he brings the king to e1, exactly to d1. King f1, d3, king e1, as you said, d2, king d1. And sadly for Kramnik, that's the finish line for the pawn. And it's just going to get gobbled up. King f8. And now, when you have bishops, you can seal diagonals and lines. And that's what Tarjan does with bishop g3, king e7, bishop d6 check. And you can see that the fun is about to be over for Kramnik. King e6, king takes d2, b6, king e3. Takes, takes. And now, black would have some chances of holding, if not for this extra b pawn that will be promoted with the help of the bishops. Now, there is one thing that white really needs to be careful with. He needs to exchange as minimally as possible. So he plays b4. That exchange is good for him because he wants to push the pawn up to b7 and win. But f5 comes. b5, well, this is the pawn exchange he can't really avoid, so he doesn't react on the king side. Takes, takes, g6, b6, h5, and now he plays g5. Because if he would start exchanging the last pawns, black might have the theoretical idea of sacrificing the rook for the pawn and a bishop, and then it would be a draw. But Tarjan says, no, I'll keep a pawn for later, and then he'll win. Because the two bishops will just win against the king, the lone king. So black played king d7, b7, and the bishop a7 idea is unstoppable, and therefore Kramnik resigned. That's how Tarjan beat Kramnik, number 2 of the world, after retirement.